The RG353VS and the RG353PS are two awesome budget-friendly handheld devices from Anbernic. They're so similar, which makes it even harder to decide which one you should get. The RG353 lineup from Anbernic is a great range of devices that are budget friendly and are great for anybody who's looking to get into retro gaming handhelds as easily and as cheaply as possible. Now there are quite a few choices to pick from. There are the RG353P and V, which are the same as the devices we're going to be looking at today, except that they also add in Android as an operating system. Personally, for the types of devices that these are, I don't believe that Android adds enough to warrant the extra cost of those devices. So today we're looking at the RG353PS and the RG353VS, both Linux handhelds. And the beauty of Anbernic's Linux handhelds is that they're so easy to get into. They are literally pick up and play. A lot of the more hardcore retro gaming enthusiasts out there like to have as many options as possible and don't mind setting up their devices from scratch. But there's a whole new wave of people coming to retro gaming handhelds now that just want to be able to pick up and play the devices that aren't necessarily tech savvy and want the easiest option possible. And this is where these built-in OSs, these Linux OSs from Anbernic, are so useful. And what's even better is most Anbernic devices come with an SD card which has loads of games already on there, so you don't even have to worry about finding ROMs yourself, which for me currently makes Anbernic the king of the pick up and play easy access retro gaming handhelds. But as we all know, Anbernic have absolutely flooded the market with so many variations of their devices, not just devices that offer different gaming experiences, but even devices like the RG353PS and the VS, which offer essentially the same gaming experience but in a different format. The RG353PS and VS for the most part are entirely identical, especially when you're looking at the internals. Both come with a 3.5-inch IPS 640x480 screen, an RK3566 quad-core 64-bit Cortex-A55 CPU with a main frequency of up to 1.8 GHz. They both carry 1GB of LPDDR4 RAM, and as we said, they both run a Linux operating system that runs off a 16GB SD card that does come provided. On top of that, they both offer 2.4 and 5G Wi-Fi and 4.2 Bluetooth all the way up to 802.11 AC. So as you can imagine, both devices play all the games that they can access pretty much identically. Now it has to be said that with these kinds of devices, with the emulators that they run, there can be small nuanced differences between even exactly the same devices. So in my playtesting, there were some slight differences. For example, playing Vice City Stories on the 353PS was a little bit more stuttery than it was on the 353VS. But a lot of these issues, especially when you're dealing with identical hardware, are due to the OS. And this is where some of the downsides of a Linux OS can come into play, and where some of the more hardcore retro gaming enthusiasts have issues with these OSs. They're not perfect and they can present some small technical issues. For me, it's never been anything that's taken away from the gameplay experience, and I've always really enjoyed using those operating systems. But if you aren't enjoying the built-in OS that comes with the VS or the PS, then you can put on custom firmware as well, and this applies to both consoles. So currently both of them are pretty much neck and neck, which is why it's so difficult to choose between the two. Even when it comes to price, the small RRP difference between the two devices is nullified when it comes to sales, with both of them currently selling for $87.99. The number one key difference between these two devices is form factor, and that's where you're going to have to make your decision. But both of them have pros and cons, not just in their actual physical use, but also in the nostalgia that they provoke. If you're going for a 353VS, you're reliving those memories of the DMG Game Boy and of all those original vertical handheld consoles that we grew up with. It might sound strange, but there's something so incredibly nostalgic about using a vertical console, even if you're playing PlayStation 1, PSP or Dreamcast games on it. There's something for me specifically that growing up with a DMG Game Boy, of having a vertical console in my hand, it just truly feels like I'm having a handheld experience. For me, it almost feels like this is the shape that handheld consoles are meant to be. And even with the inclusion of analog sticks on the lower end, it works really well and it's surprisingly comfortable. When I first saw this design, I thought that's going to be really cramped and it's not going to feel right at all. But once I had it in my hands, playing on the 353VS, even games like on the PSP, just felt so comfortable and it just felt so enjoyable. However, if we start looking at the shoulder buttons, things start getting a little bit more awkward. Vertical consoles were never designed to have shoulder buttons on there, and any design that we see with them, although it's really ingenious, it just doesn't feel right, and your fingers inevitably are cramped. No matter how comfortable you can feel using the analog sticks, your fingers are always going to cramp just trying to reach around and press the R2 and L2 buttons in those strange positions. And this for me is a huge downside downside for the RG353VS. But if we take the RG353PS for example, which strikes nostalgic memories of a SNES handheld, those shoulder buttons are so much more comfortable to use, and Anbernic have finally decided to go for staggered shoulder buttons instead of inline, which makes the whole experience even more comfortable. Although vertical consoles may feel incredibly nostalgic and may provoke that feeling of that's what true handheld gaming feels like, horizontal or landscape consoles are definitely more comfortable and are definitely a step up for ergonomics. And it's no surprise to see that pretty much every new handheld console that we see coming out goes for this form factor. Once again, the analog sticks on the RG353PS are perfectly placed and are incredibly comfortable. And the rounded shape that makes it look like a SNES controller make the RG353PS sit really comfortably in your hands, but also put your fingers in a position where they can just naturally curve over the R2 and L2 buttons. There's no doubt that the RG353PS is a more comfortable gaming experience, especially for games of the generation of the PSP and the Dreamcast, but more importantly for longer game sessions as well. The downside to the design of the RG353PS for me though is the position of some of the extra buttons. Buttons like the start and select, or the function button, or the power and reset button as well. They're on the face surrounding the screen or on the top, which in some respects is a good idea because it means you don't accidentally hit those buttons if they're on the sides, but equally they're not as nice to look at and for me visually get a little bit in the way. On top of that, it's not immediately clear between the four circular face buttons that surround the screen which ones are which. So I find myself having to look each time closer to see what each button does and what its function is. Obviously over time you'll get used to this, but for me it just wasn't as intuitive or as instinctive as it is on the RG353VS, where we have all the buttons in the expected locations that you would think they would be. It's a really difficult decision to make, and honestly it all just comes down to personal preference and what you prefer in terms of the physical design and ergonomics from a handheld console. There are some of us out there that just absolutely love the vertical design, and that truly feels like a handheld gaming system to us, and the RG353VS does a fantastic job of providing newer gameplay experiences on that kind of device. Whereas there are some of us out there as well that just want those longer gameplay experiences, or our hands are a bit bigger and just don't feel comfortable with the vertical device and need the comfort of a horizontal or landscape device like the RG353PS. To an absolute newcomer that had never ever touched a handheld gaming device in their life, I would say the RG353PS is the one to go for because it just ticks all the boxes in the right way, especially in comfort and ease of use of those shoulder buttons. But gaming, and especially retro gaming, is not just about that. We have so much more that we bring with our expectations to a console and the gameplay experience, and that's why the decision is a massively personal and unique one, and I just hope that some of this information can help you make yours. If you want to see a more detailed review of the 353PS and the VS, check out this video right here.